Hello, I'm Marina, and good evening and welcome to this webinar on responsible AI. It's a joint initiative by the Society for Computers and Law and Standards Australia. Thank you very much, Jed, for representing Standards Australia. A very big thank you to Evan Norris, the Chief Law Technologist at EY Law Oceania. He is helping me with the slides in the background and came to our aid very last minute. So an incredible person and a great technologist. I now have pop-up emails that are covering my notes, but let's proceed. Thank you for joining us as far away as was it Brisbane, Singapore, San Jose over in California. It's lovely to have you all there. And I think it's only appropriate for us to start by acknowledging the First Nations people in each of the lands in which we meet and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. For me, here in Sydney, Australia, I acknowledge the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and a very special welcome to First Nations people who are joining us this evening. We ask that you keep your cameras and audio off for the first part of this session as our panel speak and discuss issues amongst themselves. After we've heard our panel present, we will then switch over to the chat function and look for the questions that receive the most ticks. So yes, it is a popularity quest also for questions. If we have more time after that, then it'll be an extra open floor for question time. So for tonight's topic, responsible AI, what are countries and companies doing? You know, as early as 2014, Elon Musk warned that AI was an existential threat for humanity and that humanity was merely, and I quote him, a biological bootloader for digital superintelligence. He stated that AI was more dangerous than nukes. So quite serious and heavy material there. But Musk also is heavily invested in AI research. He himself runs the OpenAI and the Neuralink ventures, and believes that the only safe road for AI is in having planning, oversight and regulation. Now, for the lawyers amongst us, it gives us pause to wonder if the industry itself is saying we need regulation, we need some framework in which to operate. So the question for our panel today is responsible AI achievable? And if so, what are countries and companies doing to try and make it responsible? Tonight, we will hear from three fantastic panelists and wonderful people. Dr. Jed Horner, who's the Strategic Advisory Manager at Standards Australia. Jed works across portfolios, multiple portfolios, from infrastructure, smart cities to the digital economy, including artificial intelligence. Among his many accomplishments, and there are many, he recently helped launch the New South Wales Cybersecurity Standards Harmonisation Task Force. Not a small job there. Thank you, Jed. We have Kobi Leins, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Digital Ethics at the School of Engineering and Non-Resident Fellow at the United Nations Institute of Disarmament Research. Kobi has submitted her PhD recently to the University of Melbourne on whether the use of nanotechnology enhanced weapons is prohibited conflict. She joins us from various management roles in the United Nations and the International Committee for the Red Cross, and has worked here in New York and Geneva. It's a pleasure to have you join us today, Kobi. And can I please just remind you to please put yourselves on mute and also to switch off your camera for these earlier stages. Thank you. Now we have Aurelie also join us. She's the chair of the Artificial Intelligence Committee at Standards Australia and a member of the Australian AI Working Group established by Standards Australia. It aims to become the preeminent forum for discussing AI by engaging both government and industry. It adopts the global IEEE, and I'll give the full title of the standard, the model process for addressing ethical concerns during system design. She also participates in the European AI Alliance and is a practicing financial services lawyer in her spare time, I guess, with over 10 years experience. These are very short, condensed bios for each of our speakers. They are truly incredible speakers and have a wealth of information to share on artificial intelligence. Before I hand over to Jed, it is our intention to make this a casual and a warm environment in which we discuss these issues. But again, please put your questions in Q&A. If it's not enabled, I'll enable it shortly, and then we'll discuss those all together. We do ask, please, that you switch off your camera so as not to distract from the speakers, and you might also like to select the speaker view function, top right-hand corner of your screen, so that you have the full immersive effect of our panel, which we're going to go to straight away. Thank you, Jed. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Marina, and to the Society as well. I think it's fantastic to get together. I was actually going to start by handing over, so you're not going to hear a lot from me this evening. You'll hear some reflections after Aurelie and Kobi have spoken. And I actually might hand over first to Kobi, because Kobi is a person who's actually clearly just handed in a PhD thesis. And I think as someone who's done that as well, you know, I tip my hat. It takes a lot of work, and I think we'll start there. You get to start, Kobi, with your reflections and comments for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have Aurelie speak as well. I thought it was just appropriate that we do that to kind of tip the hat, as I said. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the warm welcome. I'm not sure that having a PhD justifies me going first, but thanks very much, Jed. Appreciate it. So what's more relevant to what I'd like to speak about is probably some of my work prior to the PhD, and what I'm really interested in, or one of the areas that I'm still looking at, is the idea of how the governance works in relation to technology from an international perspective. And that part of that involves standards, which Aurelie will talk a little bit more about, but part of it's also happening at a global level. The parts that I'm really interested in are really fragmented. So the UN, for example, is looking at governing AI across a number of agencies, and it's a bit of a grab bag. So whether you're looking at the International Postal Union or the International Telecommunications Union, they are all trying to set up standards and governance structures for AI and technologies for computing of different kinds. But then at the same time, I'm affiliated, for example, with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and they're also doing a lot of work on technologies and disarmament, and how technology can actually be used to either enhance armament control, the control of weapons or the use of weapons during warfare, or the production of weapons that can be used to regulate, but also they're talking about the risks of these technologies. And then in addition to that, there's also another group that meets at the UN to just talk about governing cyber as a specific category. And so what you see, which I think is fairly characteristic of other types of governance structures as well, is this really fragmented, isolated, not necessarily coherent approach where different agencies within the UN are looking at using data and technologies in very different ways. And another example, just to throw into the mix, is that the World Food Programme announced a few months ago that they're actually using Palantir to collect data about some of the refugees and the people that they're protecting. And we're finding out that some of that information is also getting back to governments who are then deciding whether they're legitimate refugees or not. So across the UN peacekeeping missions, each mission is using technology differently and has different governance structures. So just to paint a picture of general chaos and intrigue is, I think, a fairly accurate one at this stage, where a lot of people are trying to grapple with or to govern in very different ways. That also has flow-on effects for governments, many of which are engaging with these different fora in different ways. So individual governments are engaging with these different UN agencies, but they're also obviously talking to each other. So they're trying to work both bilaterally, but also regionally to create some sort of coherent governance structure. And in all of this is the standards approach. And one of the things I think that I really wanted to highlight is that in all of these processes, what's really important is legitimacy. And so whether it's legitimacy from being an all-inclusive governance structure, in that different parties come to the table and negotiate these limitations to uses or guidance for uses, or thinking about use for all. So not just governance for a particularly narrow group, but governance for all and being consistent. I think that's where I personally find the standards work really, really interesting, because it is bottom up. Each country individually is coming up with standards that are then negotiated and filtered up. But it's also these governance structures are also being contemplated to work top down, so they're having a very broad effect. It's really important that we think about these systems as not being mutually exclusive. So when you've got, whether you've got international governance or regional governance or national governance, what's important to think about is that all of these systems, much like the situation we see ourselves in with COVID, don't stand alone or work independently. And so each of these systems is connected to other systems, either in the way, the data that they're collecting, the data that they're using, the algorithms that are being used. And so the interoperability, if we think about, and there's been a lot of talk about the app, for example, it can protect or help to track where COVID goes. The interoperability of these systems is really key. So even if one government has the perfect regulation, which I don't think any government would claim to have at the present, there's still that added element of this is an area that requires everyone to come together at the table. And that's not easy. Having worked in international negotiations for some years, we might assume that we all have similar values around how technology should be used, what it should be used for. But the reality is that we all bring a cultural angle, interpretation, prioritization, which makes those negotiations particularly fascinating. And there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll hand over to Aurelie now, who's a much better place to talk about the standards. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kobi. Definitely agree. When I first entered the world of AI, I think there was pretty much about 10 articles per day with a different framework, and I was looking to the US and to the EU. At the time, there was not much happening in Australia, and I was really looking on how can you have like a more unified perspective on the regulation, and that's how I entered the world of standards. So I have to say I'm now involved through the IEEE with US initiative and with ISO through the all international initiative, and obviously keep an eye on the EU. And I have to say the work that the committee I'm chairing, so the work of IT 043, we have pretty much 47 countries at the table and looking at what it means to have good governance and trustworthy AI system. So from my perspective, I think the way I got into standard was I thought the law will eventually get there, but in the meantime, you needed a very concrete solution that could be provided by best practices. That was from my experience dealing with algo traders, and that's where I think the standards are really adding value. So just from pure numbers, if you look at the role of standards in the world, they affect about 80% of global trade. So just from that number, it's I reckon any organization should be mindful of standards. Then you look at, I think China was the first one to start with standard initiative on AI and strategy, one of the first. And from that day till the initiative in Australia, you'll see pretty much standards are mentioned as the one initiative that's common to all those strategies, to all those government strategy. So I think when you look at AI best practice and implementing best practice, I think it's very hard to ignore the work of standards. I'm a little bit biased, obviously, since I'm chairing the committee. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the work that the committee's been doing. So as Kobi mentioned, it's one country, one vote. So that's particularly important from the ISO perspective. It allows to have a unified approach and voice. So my committee represents as a voice of Australia as an international standard on AI, and the work we're doing is particularly focused on, particularly relevant for lawyers, the governance of AI system. Most of the work that's quite advanced is on governance, risk management, the reliability of AI system, but also bias and the issue of fairness. And the latest work that's coming into play is looking at effectively data quality, how to manage them, because this is obviously quite important. What type of data are suitable to be ingested by AI system, but also the quality of the model. So this is the elements that are the basis for the recipe of trustworthy AI from a standards perspective. And as you say, back to your initial comment, this is a fragmented world. And in this fragmented world, I see the standards initiative as being the source that make all the ingredients together at the moment. I'll finish on this.
Thank you both so much. And I mean, I'm spoiled from my perspective to get to work with both of you. So my sincere appreciation too. It's no secret that both Aurelie and Kobi are engaged in this work as well. And I've been there from the beginning, which is also somewhat unique in a standards body where you get to drive work and stay around and see things evolve, which I think is also important as well. I'm going to pick up on a few of the comments in the chat function, because I've seen Mark Ebeling, I've seen Yvonne make a few really good points, and I do want to pick up on that. But I might just, to weave together what Aurelie and Kobi were just saying, also underline another point which people allude to, but I don't think tackle up front. And it crosses over to some of our ethical discussion. So it's the political dimension of this work, and particularly the geopolitical dimension. So Aurelie was speaking about the work that's going on in Europe. We've referenced the UN system, and Kobi's spoken in diplomatic terms about how messy, I suppose, that can be in terms of getting consensus and agreement. And we see that in human terms. So we shouldn't be surprised that we see it in discussions around technology. And I think that's a key challenge. And it gets down into the weeds about standards too. So we would be remiss not to talk about and to think about the tensions that impact on standardization. So we live in a multipolar world, if you use that phraseology, and I'm probably using, from political science, that term. But if you think about the EU as a bloc, and it's a powerful bloc to regulate for good and for ill, depending on your perspectives, a key consideration. You think about the emergence of China, who've explicitly called out standards as a way, not necessarily to collaborate, I might say, but as a way to facilitate trade almost solely in their own interests. It's important to call that out. People box around it. They talk about China playing in multilateral systems, which we welcome. We all welcome that as free trading nations. But there are other agendas about exporting standards. So when you talk to people who've crafted 200 AI standards, they just haven't bothered to share that with their US or European colleagues. That's interesting. It actually says something about economic intentions on the part of a country. And then I suppose finally the United States as well, where we're seeing the work that people like Aurelie and Kobi are driving actually assume some prominence. So if you go back and you look at the executive order, and I'm talking about people like Michael Kratsios and others who very much work in the White House, the executive order that came out, it actually explicitly references standards. So it says we should use principles, we should use the market power the United States has, and many companies coming out of the US who I would argue are responsible in terms of how they use and develop technology historically. And you can counterbalance that with others who aren't. There's a clear call to action and to arms there for companies to get involved in standardization, which they are. So I'm not speaking out of school, but IBM have lent in heavily, Microsoft, Google increasingly, all responsible, mature technology actors who are looking at how they can actually build effective rails for responsible use of technology. And that's the point I wanted to get to, because Mark Ebeling, who I also know, who's a fantastic contributor in this space and other realms, asked a question, and it's a great one. What's the difference between responsible and ethical AI use? Aurelie and Kobi, I might open to you on this point in a second. I have a view on that. I have a view that the ethical discussion runs people round and round, and people who haven't necessarily thought about these issues deeply get caught up in that. So your view of responsible use might be you can use it in military settings, provided it's covered by the laws of the country. That's my particular view. Or intelligence settings, again, and there'll be divergent political views on that, and that's exactly what they are. They're political views, and they are to be resolved through formal structures, which is when you go to the ballot box, the institutions of government that oversight those agencies. That's how I see ethics and politics being in play. And I don't necessarily see the standards world as a place where we make those sort of explicit judgments, knowing that when we go in, we're going to get a very slippery product or artifact that might actually not serve our purposes. And I think to the question that Mark raised, we could better start talking about potentially responsible AI use. So I wanted to stop there with those initial reflections. It's very political, but that's where I've tended to be dragged into these discussions globally with our partners, is those discussions on the politics of technology, which I think we don't explicitly talk about. We tend to take it down a level and talk about ethics, forgetting that immediately goes into the realm of the political. And the work that Aurelie, Kobi and others, and many of you on this call are doing through standards and the like, is to make things more meaningful, measurable, and to put assurance in place in terms of technology, which is much more tangible than having a dialogue. And for some of the people having these discussions, I mean, they've just found that they've got values, which I find quite amusing. It's like you've got grown adults who might have spent 40 or 50 years walking around the world, interacting with people, intervening in political life, and they've suddenly figured they've got some values they want to inject into technology, which I find amusing. And on that note, I might hand over to Kobi and Aurelie to talk through those points, and then hopefully all of you on the line can add more to the chat. And I'm just looking at the log now. We can go to that. Who wants to go first? Provocation.
Oh, I'm happy to jump in if it's helpful, Aurelie. Look, you've asked so many interesting questions, and there's the correct answer, and then there's the actual political answer, which is a little bit more challenging. So I'm going to try and walk the line of talking more frankly. I think you're right that when we talk about tech, one of the things that we're often not talking about is power. These tools are incredibly powerful. They work at scale, they work at speed. They make decisions from the very inception of an idea through to the end output. And that occurs at the data selection point, the choice of algorithm, the type of learning, whether it's simple or whether it's complex machine learning. About a year ago, I'm going to answer this with a small anecdote. About a year ago, I started looking, or 2 years ago now, I started looking at the ethics AI strategies, and I read over 100 of them, both corporate and government. And the conclusion that I came to after trying to find some consistent thread was that there isn't any. And I think we've moved a long way in the last 2 years from realizing that ethics, which comes from philosophy, provides us with frameworks of identifying and prioritizing values, to realizing that it doesn't create a safe outcome. It doesn't necessarily, just because we've contemplated the ethics doesn't mean that we're necessarily building the best thing that we can. And it sort of ties in with the question of good AI as well. And there are some pieces now being written about this, about whose AI is good. Good for whom? Is it good for the people who it's being used against? Who's in the room when it's chosen as a tool? If you asked, some of the minority or minoritized communities, I should say, when they're having this technology used against them, I'm sure that they don't think it's very good, and yet the powers using them think it's a very effective, efficient tool. So I think the terms that we use, we need to be really careful with, but at the same time, ethics provides us with an awareness, as you say, and a pathway to start to ask some of the difficult questions, and for people to become aware of their blind spots. So most of the tech, I've got a picture of the old computers in the, this is an IBM in the 1950s. They were built by predominantly white men. The programming is done by predominantly white men. The programmers were women until it became a profession, and then they dropped away in the 80s. So the programming now is also still the software, the hardware, all of this is very homogenized. And so having more people in the room, and this is where the ethics, I think, comes to the fore, is thinking about all of the people whose voices need to be heard. And that in that sense, it's really, really important. I'll make one final point, which is that when we talk about ethical, we're also talking about processes. And when it comes to standards, for example, you can talk about having the highest ethics in the world, but unless you have some kind of whistleblowing component or a safety valve for people to notify and identify where there are risks, it doesn't matter how good your notions are, there still have to be practical tools in place to implement or back up those ethical notions. Aurelie, I'd love to hear your views on this.
Yes, definitely. So following from Kobi, I'll take a similar tack in that for me, as I say, I'll start always with the law. So I think that's the basis. So with responsible AI, you start acting reasonably and you follow the baseline. If you look at the principles, the AI ethics principle mostly developed, they also mostly refer to discrimination law, human rights law, etc. So generally it's referring to those principles. And ethics is more, again, maybe that's a cynical lawyer in me, the aspiration that a company has. So it's your North Star. So it's definitely the end game where a company can get a competitive advantage by going beyond the requirement on the law and just acting particularly ethically in certain domain. But it has, I think, with the incidents that we see to date, looking at AI, it's generally poor design or poor governance models. So it starts first and foremost by looking at an organization governance and compliance mechanism and risk mechanism, make sure they actually fit for the technology. Because as Kobi said, AI provide extremely great strength and power and should be managed accordingly. So for that perspective, the first piece is good governance. Once you have that, once you have good governance, while you manage to comply with the law, then how can you promote your value further than the law and promote the actual ethics or promoting promoting ethics beyond the requirement of the law. And as you see, this is not specific to AI. Effectively, most of those AI ethics principles that we see are inspired from bioethics. And if you look at even, I'll digress from AI, like nanotechnology, they have the exact same problem. They've been looking at how do you implement this principle, and they go back to really what is the law requiring, where there's a need to have some change in the law, etc. So in a nutshell, start with the law, building up to the ethics.
And I love that approach, Aurelie, and thank you, Kobi, as well. I actually might take us back to a point you made about broadly power relations. And we also have had a flurry of questions, which I want to acknowledge, really good comments on a few pieces I might pick up. And Kobi, you spoke about, I think you alluded to the fact that when we're talking about this, it might be automated decision-making more broadly, that is in the public realm. So that's the political object, if you will. That's what gets people motivated. And of course, then you have your more academic definitions of what is AI. But of course, politically or in real terms, that doesn't touch sides, because what might drive the discussion in terms of power relations is the common definitions we hold. And so I might open that discussion up, because Tim D'Souza, I know, asked a really good question about, in Australia, and it is context specific, some of the ways in which we've applied decision-making and how they might not work in the interests of particular, historically marginalised communities. I might also flip that before I go there and ask you, how might we tackle those issues differently? So unpacking all those issues around diversity we just spoke about, but how might we actually approach decision-making, Aurelie, to your point as well, differently, harnessing standards if we have the law in mind and we have all those frameworks in mind, including Kobi, our human rights obligations, which are global and binding. And also cite the opposite to that, which is that in New Zealand, including under a National Party government and people who I work with, we actually achieved a few amazing things in terms of social outcomes for Māori people under Hekia Parata, who was a Māori Minister of Education, who instituted specific programs along with a whole of government stream of work, which was around using big data analytics to identify at-risk groups and target resources more appropriately. And I would argue, in terms of outcomes, it had a desired impact, and that was largely positive. Lots has been written on it, but I think there are a few flip side examples where it is about the government maturity and it's about the deployment of technology, and it's about the people, Kobi, to your point, that are actually in the decision-making tree, that actually determine whether it's successful. And so I actually did want to pose a rather provocative question too, is that, do we have particular challenges with this in Australian government settings about being able to apply and implement automated decision-making systems? If that's the case, and if it's not, that's fine too, how can we actually harness the law, and I think standards too, Aurelie and Kobi, to try and resolve or work through some of those tensions? Because it's clear that using a more organic approach, as we've seen, can also result in tensions. Whoever wants to dive in first.
I'm happy to dive in, or at least it looks like you're waiting for me. It's an extremely political and nuanced question. Automated systems were already contemplated being used by the Australian government in 2004. A paper was written under John Howard, which now seems like a very, very long time ago. And in this paper, guidelines and guardrails were suggested to how governments should use automated decision-making. And a colleague and I have we're just publishing a paper on that, looking at what was contemplated in 2004 versus how the automated systems are being used now. And we know that there are more than 20 different pieces of legislation that enable automated decision-making within the Australian government. We don't know which of those have been activated necessarily. We obviously know of the more public cases, such as Robodebt and the tax office using some of these systems through Pinteric, the appeal where the decision was appealed that a tax case was, the decision on a tax case was actually automatically generated. So we have case law, we do know about some of the uses, but we don't know about all of them. And what sits behind these, particularly as we've just had in the last couple of days, some of the hearings around the uses of Robodebt, I think what we tend to talk about less are the political values behind these. So why do we want to use automation? Obviously, we can expedite decision-making, we can be more consistent potentially, but I think going back to this 2004 document, the government was already contemplating what some of the risks were, and the conclusion was that where decisions require a certain amount of discretion, that they shouldn't necessarily be automated. And so I think there's a lot more risk than is acknowledged. There's a lot more damage that can be done. And I refer to Ed Santo, who gave a wonderful presentation at a conference a little while ago, where he referred to, you know, the three words "in due course" in law. Something happened, it was fixed in due course. In that period of in due course, people's lives can be so profoundly affected using these machines. And again, because of the scale and speed of automated decision-making, governments need to be sure that they're both complying with existing law, but also that there's recourse. And there's a lot of work going on in this space. And I saw in some of the questions, not just in terms of explainability, but also contestability, which mean different things within a technical context. So we need a lot more technical and legal and other expertise, social expertise in the room to discuss how these systems are used and what the guardrails are. And standards play into that in Australia in a really strong way, I think.
On this, I agree. There's definitely a maturity point. If you just look at, again, the news in the UK and the systems that's been developed to grade the students, and I think this is just not government; it's also industry at large. There's a tendency to seize a new shiny AI system and grab it without thinking about the impact it has on its ecosystem. I think that's where I think the UN is just doing some good work on doing a human rights assessment and guidance, impact assessment and guidance, and proposing for government and leaders in technology to use this as being the best ground, so that obviously government and industry can be a bit more transparent and understand the impacts they have on the ecosystem. So that's the first step. Obviously, I often hear, in order to get more trust, we need to be more transparent. I think it's the reverse. There was a good TED talk explaining that effectively we're in a world where the trust is gone. So that's why you need transparency. And that's why transparency here is the only way to verify that the system worked as per the requirements, and that's why explainability is key. Again, lots of work is being done on explainability on this piece that's out in the EU. So I think the UK ICO has done some very good guidelines on all the explanation companies are to provide. So you see there's more and more guidelines coming. I think from going back to automated decision-making for government, effectively they now understand, at least you see because of the new guidelines coming from the different regulators, you see the maturity slowly coming on what are the best practice for procurement, what are the best practice for explainability. They're even tackling fairness. So for me, the next challenge is going to be matching what's going to be fairness, the mathematical definition against the legal definition. That's my strong interest. But in a nutshell, I'd like to think we've learned from RoboDebt, from those big system fail, and slowly we're trying, at least some governments are trying to start to put the guardrails in place. And that's where, again, the role of standards for me is key, because it's putting international guardrails and setting really that best practice, so that effectively when someone asks you, how do you define fairness? How do you ensure that you mitigate unfair bias? The standards provide a base tool to deal with those issues.
And then I'm just going to draw you both on a question, because there's lots of good thought coming through the lines. You know, one from Rob Hansen around Kobi, picking up on your point around communication. The first question I have, I suppose, arising from that is, how do we do that? So there's a lot of a tendency at the moment to push independent guidelines country by country, then create reporting mechanisms, have dialogues and the like. What mechanisms do you think are effective there, or are international standards part of that mix? First question. And the second question, which Jeff has raised, and I think is a very valid one, when you look at work both here in Australia and across the Tasman with their algorithm charter in New Zealand as well, and certainly the UK's work, is the distinctions that are drawn between government and then the private sector, noting that there's a lot of interaction between the two insofar as many are service providers. Should we make distinctions between the use of AI in terms of how we regulate, how we use principles-based approaches? What are your thoughts on that second question too?
Who do you want to start? I feel like we should break it up a little bit. Do you want to jump in, Aurelie? Or, but while you're thinking, I'm just going to say one last thing about the last question, which I think we really need to cover and we haven't touched on, is just data security in terms of the government maturity. So whatever we think about the governance of the algorithms, we've had a number of situations where Australians' data has not been kept safe. And that is something that I think the government really has to work on, to have trust of people to want to provide or connect various sources of their data in the way that the government would really like to use automation going forward. But I'll hand over to you, Aurelie, on that little point, just to round off the last discussion.
Yes, so on your point, Jed, I think in this case, what I'd like to avoid is to keep that this dispersed initiative keeping on growing, because it would be great as a lawyer. It would create more work for us. So I would be very happy to advise on many different legislation and their interaction, but effectively from an organization perspective, from a government perspective, as I say, AI is all about interoperability, as Kobi said. So in order to be able to harness AI and not having those barriers for each country, then we need to look and adopt at like an international framework. And I think if you look at the work that the regulators are doing currently, they are working globally. It's not just now. We just look at what happened with Cambridge Analytica. They all quickly jumped on together to tackle that issue. And you start to see it again with Clearview AI. The regulators are starting to talk to each other. So I think the end game would be to have a more aligned regulation that can be translated from country to country fairly easily. And I think that was the idea. We started with the principle, again, that was just a guidance. Now we have to work through the best practice and work on the rules of law accordingly.
Thank you, Aurelie. And I might also just dive in there. I saw we had questions from John Canning as well, saying we need a body like the UN. I mean, my response to that would say we have it in ISO. We can't often say that. We also have the ITU, which I'll get to in a second. But I think if you read the text of the OECD principles of AI, as Aurelie alluded to just a second ago, and you look at the G20 ministerial statement, there's very deliberate wording in those around standards being developed, because we actually don't want, and I can say this on a public stage, I don't mind being recorded, but there are countries who would have very, very competing political values, which are inimical to our interests as a country, who will use other forums like the ITU to push their interests. So as a country, I would suggest it's tempting to get pulled into all sorts of initiatives, but there is a clear G20 ministerial statement with our minister's signature on it as well, the OECD principles, which we as a country have signed up to, and then we've got ISO as a place to develop technical standards. We have other forums. The problem for a middle power like Australia and a country with only so many resources is if we go into every realm, as Aurelie was saying, and we try to exert our influence, automatically we don't have a strong voice, and automatically that voice is fractured. And so to pretend you'll go in there and project that voice strongly, it is really, and Kobi can probably speak to this, is problematic. And we're seeing that in other forums. I might also flag to people, there is a critical technology strategy forthcoming soon, which will be a case of watch this space, because I anticipate, and that's coming out of DFAT, I anticipate these issues will receive coverage as well, if you look at the public comments of the government. So it's worth keeping that at the back of your minds too, that there's a strong element of our global tech diplomacy as well coming into this. But we do have the bodies, and we are leading in to do the work. And I think the work Aurelie's leading with colleagues is an example of trying to build those effective global mechanisms and lean in on multilateralism, which even Mike Pompeo, to quote someone else, is actually encouraging us to do. Who would have thought? I do also want to go back to those questions. We've had a range of other ones talking about data ownership too. So I know that seems left of field, but I think that question's really pertinent, because I know every ordinary person you talk to, and tech people often forget this when they're really in the weeds and talking about programming language or definitions of AI, that's the trigger that actually gets people hooked, as the question is rightly posed. And I do want to ask you both about that. We've seen the CDR, consumer data rights, being created in Australia. We're seeing mechanisms of creating data ownership. And Aurelie, I'm particularly keen to get your comments on this as a lawyer as well, because as you know, people don't own data. They own databases and data sets from a proprietary perspective. But I actually want to draw you on that is, whilst we're pushing this from a consumer end, do you think there's any dilemmas we create by actually commodifying data? And whilst that might be a push back against the perceived capturing of data by large corporations, do you see any issues with that as well, like in terms of it backfiring? Because you're actually commodifying something that at the moment, my advice legally is that it's not a thing.
Definitely, Jed. So on your point of commodifying data, effectively the European data supervisor had an ethics advisory committee looking just at this issue back in 2017. And what they explained was, their suggestion was data should be considered more as your hand and not like as a car or let's say your house, because it can benefit a number of people, and it should not be commodified in a property, because then you end up in a standard contract. It should much more, it should be protected more so, like, as I say, your hand, for lack of better explanation. And you start to see, like, what's been very interesting is in India and in France, there's at the moment some new bills coming into place that are looking at promoting innovation, so allowing to share data between organization and company, but let's see how that evolves, but on the basis that it will promote the benefit of the society. So building on that that initial concept that data is here to benefit society and the individuals, without making it a good like any other property. So there's the legislation that just started this, the bill that just started this year in both countries, and they're looking at doing data trust. Obviously, there's issues around the terms of the data trust that I need to be who is able to manage the data trust, how is the data trust, how is the data trust are supposed to release the data, what's the governance around those topics. That's going to be a very exciting development, I think.
Yeah,
Kobi,
sorry, there's a bit of background noise. I had a bilateral exchange last year, which was one of the most interesting email exchanges with a privacy lawyer and a computer scientist who said, let's just make data property, and was actually trying to set up a company to do so. And I don't think I'm giving away state secrets to say that the conversation was interesting, because what came up, which Aurelie touched upon, is that once you start looking at data as property per se, you hit up against issues of what happens to that property when you pass. How do you retain ownership in that? Like, where do you retain ownership in that property? How do you ensure that payment is fair? And I think it would be remiss not to mention this context, Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, where she talks about the frameworks that we have are just not set up for how data is being used. And there is only going to be more data collected because that's what we need to run these algorithms at speed and at scale. So with that in mind, I don't have the answers, but I think that the property model that we have was built for another time and place. And some of the most interesting work that I'm seeing is being done in what's referred to as a sandbox space. So the Germans, for example, are putting aside some of the laws and just saying, let's have a try of this system. We want this outcome at the end. We're going to put a whole lot of sociologists on this for a few years, and we're going to research this. But traditionally, looking at some of these applications using traditional law just isn't cutting it. And whether it's property law, or now in the case of Uber in Australia, that's having the tort of conspiracy brought against it for jumping over the taxi regulations, the law is not necessarily fit for purpose, and we have to be a lot more creative. I think that's the challenge for lawyers going forward, to find ways to recraft how we think about governance and trust and assurance, and making sure that the most vulnerable are protected, which is ultimately what we should be doing.
Thank you. I've also got another question on the line from Karen Kuhlman as well, from IBM, which is a great question about the New Zealand approach. So I'm sure both of you have read the algorithm charter, but did you want to comment on that? I might kick off by saying it interested me because I can see how standards plug into that approach. So it's a very high level, sort of broad commitment with a matrix of assessment, which isn't granular enough to really, I would argue, do a lot of the assessments. And it's also not a uniform definition of AI. However, I can see it working in harmony. Whereas I think in Australia, we're trying to do a fully regulated approach end to end, which I'm interested to see how that lands up working out. But I wanted to ask you both in your reflections on New Zealand, and Kobi, I know you've written about this as well. So I might start with you, Aurelie, and then come back to you, Kobi, if that's okay.
So we actually had one in one of our panel. I think it was Toby Walsh, and we had a few people from Singapore and New Zealand, and we had a representative that actually worked on the New Zealand algorithm charter. So they explained a little bit the work that was underway, and I completely agree that they've just put forward the principles and some risk assessment, and this is a good step forward, as you said, without being too imposing on the regulatory path. The good thing, again, from my perspective from standards, is whether they go towards a regulatory path or not, they will still need the best practice. So the advantage of standards is when it comes to assess under the principle whether the algorithm is discriminatory or not, what are the tools you're going to need to be able to assess this? And that's where you turn to standards. When you're going to have to assess the risk posed by AI system, again, that's when the risk management process that we have in place will substantiate the ones that the principle and the rules that imply at the government level. So I think I agree with your analysis where New Zealand is at, and it's been leading generally on this piece. It's also got, I have to say, to New Zealand. It's got some amazing AI startups. Soul Machine to Court One that actually did some amazing work for the NDIS initially. So they've been, and they have the AI forum that's also doing some amazing work. So they've chose one approach that is slightly different from Australia, but from my perspective, as I say, if I look at Standard, I think that's the beauty of the Standard. It provides agile governance mechanism to implement AI in all the different jurisdictional environment, and that's where I see the advantage of it.
I think you're demonstrating your own personal bias, Jed, by focusing on the New Zealand example here, a bias which I luckily happen to share. It's a fantastic piece of work. But as I mentioned earlier, Australia was doing something similar in 2004. They just weren't quite as public about it. So I don't know whether it's technically the first charter. We did something similar, which is we were leading. In 2004, I think Australia was ahead of the pack in actually contemplating what this guidance should be in anticipation of the technology that didn't even really exist yet. So I think it's a, yeah, it's a fantastic addition.
Thank you so much. I'm just mindful of time. Look, I did see a last comment from Tim D'Souza about how we build capacity in-house, and he's posed the question of ethicists. I might also say more broadly, how do we just get more diverse people in the tent? It's funny how many of these issues are not ethical at all. They're about, as Aurelie alluded to, anti-discrimination law, and not calling out one attribute such as gender alone. So I might broaden that question as well, and then give you a chance both to close on that note before I hand back to Marina. We could keep talking, I'm sure, all night. The questions from everyone on the line have been fantastic. It demonstrates the depth we can go into, and I hope we do at later stages. And I know you're both doing that in your work as well. So I might hand over for final comments, but I might also ask you both to nominate one or two pieces of work along the lines we've discussed tonight that you think are ones to watch in this space. So it might be the work within the standards committees, Aurelie, that you think have got real potential and global buy-in, and the same for you, Kobi, because I know we've got a very diverse audience on the line, and I know people will want to leave with a few things to sort of to watch and see how they mature as the questions have run tonight.
I'm happy to jump in, Aurelie. I think we focused a lot on government in this session, and there were a couple of questions about corporate. Should they have different guardrails? Should they be thinking about different things? Having worked quite a bit with some of the corporates, I think what's really important to restate, or what we haven't perhaps covered much, is that there is a lot of law that already covers what companies need to be doing, and arguably the government as well. So from a director's point of view, from non-exec director's point of view, there is I think a growing awareness of responsibility, and that comes out of cases like Volkswagen and Boeing, where even if you'd had a digital ethics ethicist on the team, Tim, to your point, Tim D'Souza, even if you'd had someone on your team, it wouldn't necessarily have had the impact enough to avoid the litigation that arose out of those cases. And in answer to where I see a lot of interesting work being done, I'm a lawyer who sits within a computer science school as part of a centre on AI and digital ethics. And the work that we're doing with the students is not necessarily, along with my two colleagues who are actually trained ethicists, is not necessarily to make them specialised in ethics, but to make them aware of what the risks are. And part of that is teaching them communication skills, how to know where to go when they have a problem, how to communicate concerns, how to be part of a community, more broadly, how computer science communities need to be engaging with each other because they're at different levels of maturity in terms of awareness of the risks. So from a corporate perspective, if you were looking to manage risk, I think there are a whole range of things that could be done to respond to existing law, but that's not to say that the law is complete. And just to do a shout out for a project that I'm working on, one of the things that I'm looking at the moment is mapping, in conjunction with AUSCL, we are doing a map of all of the law in Australia that currently applies to digital or technical systems, which sounds ambitious, and it is, but we need a baseline of where we are with the law. The standards then also supplement and complement where these laws are, but I don't think we can talk about where we're missing law or where there is no law, which is how a lot of these conversations start. And in fact, what the German government said in a public document, that Australia has no law in these areas, that is incorrect. And we need to make sure that practitioners within Australia and also internationally are aware that we are very engaged in this space. Aurelie.
Yes, and that's a point I want to add to, because what I saw in the chat too, can we regulate AI? The first question I hear is, because there's lots of talk of ethics and principle, etc., there's a tendency to ignore that effectively we're still talking now about discrimination law, about human rights law, and about privacy law. So the UK GDPR is actually have an article 33 that's looking at explaining AI decision, or automated decisions, that includes AI decision. The ACCC is now very good at and has been doing so at looking at automated decision. Just look at the case of Trivago versus ACCC. They're very good at understanding AI and let's say litigate, taking companies into in front of court for when the AI is making representation and it's deemed deceptive. Misleading and deceptive. I'll add, before I jump to the next point, one piece building on Kobi, what she was saying, most definitely the law is evolving. What I'm actually super enthusiastic about is the EU did a report on accountability and liability this year. That's if this is the new bar that's set up, that's going to be very interesting for organization, because in the report what they say is, if it's too hard for individuals to effectively prove that, to establish causation, it will be up to organization to showcase that they had the best process in place to make sure the system was fit for purpose and safe. So that would be quite a game changer if this is going forward. And again, so in that case, that makes the work, that's where organization will need really good practices, like to implement, that's when I think there will be, to get to Tim's question, there'll be a necessity to actually adopt those best practices and bringing in those people that have the capabilities to look at how to embed human rights and discrimination law in the design phase as part of the design phase of the development of AI system. Coming back to the interesting work that's going on with the standards, obviously there's, you'll see in this AI standard roadmap that Standard Australia has produced, there's a reference to the AI management system. And just in April this year, at the last plenary meeting of the international standard, it has been agreed that we're going to proceed with that AI management system. And why is that important? Because this management system will lead to, it's a certification path for AI system. So this will give companies the ability to certify the AI system down the track, and a way to achieve responsible AI. So for us in the standard world, that AI management system is quite key, and you'll see that there's other there's other management systems that have been extremely successful in the world of standard, like 9001, just as an example. So at this point, the work of standards is going driving fairly well, and on AI management standard, it's going to be something to watch.
Thank you so much for that, Aurelie and Kobi, and for your comments tonight, and to everyone who's joined us and added to the chat, because it was actually an amazing pleasure to sit through and look at all those questions. And there's many more we didn't get to, which we would have loved to, but we have to get going, I suppose, at some point too. Thank you both again, and thanks to everyone for making time out of your day to join us. We know you're all busy, and we look forward to picking up this discussion in the future as well. I'm sure we can dive into some detail around some of these areas too. So thanks, everyone. Marina, over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Jed. As promised, we had a fantastic panel. Thank you all. Thank you, Aurelie. Thank you, Kobi. Thank you, Jed. Exceptional panel. And your generosity in giving your time, your expertise to us today is really something. Thank you from us all.